brightening the corner where I was, I started with educating the people in close circles to me, the ones I came in contact every day. And every person in our office could tell you about this and have an intelligent discussion. Everybody that waited on me on a routine basis where I ate lunch in downtown Detroit could tell you about it. And friends that I thought would abandon me kind of closed ranks behind me and basically gave me some pretty good moral support while this was taking place. I remember I showed the materials to my pastor, who went on to become the head of Moody Bible Institute. And I thought he would take the ball and run with it. I hoped he would take the ball and run with it. Basically, he kind of looked at me like I was crazy. And at that point I thought, my clients pay me for advice. They'll listen. So my clients, anybody that scheduled an appointment with me, ended up getting a seminar on the New Age movement, whether they wanted it or not. And they went out and they told their respective ministers and priests and friends about it. I had a call one day from a Catholic priest in Detroit, Father Edward Perrone, and he said that a parishioner who had not darkened a church door in many years had come to see him and was terrified. He said, "What did you have that scared this man so badly?" I invited him to come take a look. Well, he came to my office on a Friday afternoon. He looked through my materials. He gasped at some of them. He said, "I can hardly believe I'm holding this in my hand." And finally, he said, "I have to accept the truth of what you're saying." He said, "I saw too much of this going through the seminary." He said, "We have a terrible job facing us, how to wake people up without scaring them to death." Because when I was looking at the materials, and I have something on the computer I'd like to show you later when I can set up adequately for the PowerPoint. But 1983, the New Agers really thought they were going to pull things off in 1982. 1982 was a target year for them. 1975 was a target year to make teachings on their new Messiah public. But at the point I was looking at it, I didn't know I was looking at that yet. I didn't understand fully what I was looking at until I found a book by a California writer named Marilyn Ferguson called The Aquarian Conspiracy, Personal and Social Change in the 1980s. And all the things I found disturbing, she found encouraging. She said, now the heretics are gaining ground. Doctrine is losing its authority. And knowing is superseding belief. And she quoted from a book called The Aquarian Gospel of Jesus the Christ. And for some reason, when I read the quote, I thought it was terribly important that I find that book, and I did track it down the very next day at the Methodist bookstore, I'm sorry to say. And Dixon Bible and Books, which was owned by a member of my own church, I'm sorry to say, had copies of the book in stock as well. And it was basically written in King James style English. And this was about Jesus, obviously the jet setter. He wasn't hanging around Palestine. He was traveling to India and China. And the Aquarian master sitting in council had told us that Jesus was not always the Christ, that just as Jesus had earned the degree Christ by a life of strenuous service and equipping himself to find the Christ consciousness, that Jesus wasn't always, just as Lincoln was not always president, Edward was not always king, neither was Jesus always the Christ. He had earned the degree Christ by these certain practices. And they had John the Baptist was also out seeking wisdom, and he also had pagan masters. And John the Baptist one day asked his pagan masters, per this version, the Aquarian Gospel, he said, why do we need any further illumination? These teachings, the Vedas, the Upanishads, these are so sublime, so perfect. And his master explained to him, He said, in the past, when man needed illumination and progress to advance to a further point, the masters would send somebody. Said, but now the ages have passed, and he said, in their proper place, the Hebrew Psalms and Bible, the Hebrew Psalms and Proverbs were given for man's enlightenment. Said, but now that age is past, and it is time for more revelation, and Jesus is the flesh-made messenger to bring that light to man. But in the ages yet to come, man will attain to greater lights, and greater lights will be needed and sent. And I wrote in my margin a neat trick. I said, and finally at last, a mighty master soul will arise to light the way to the throne of perfect man. I slammed that book shut. I was spastic. I knew I just looked at something about and promoting and preparing folks for the Antichrist. And I had to learn more about it. The information sources were deficient. Marilyn Ferguson said that folks that were involved in this communicated with code words and signals, that they were made kindred by their inner earthquakes. And that's very important that you remember that, because that's the glue that binds them together. It's not money, it's an ideology, but it's basically mass hypnosis. Folks, by one method of mind control, one method of spiritual deviation, one method of going out of their minds, make this, quote, paradigm shift. And this is what the, quote, Christian books were also talking about. I've since collected some. One was SPCK, Society for the Propagation of Christian Knowledge. It was from England, and they actually told us we should pay heed to Benjamin Krem, Alice Bailey, and Helena Petrovna Blavatsky. I decided that if they communicated that way, that maybe I could tap into that. And I didn't know what their signals were. But she said they use code words, and I was having a pretty good notion of what their vocabulary was. Things were done holistically. We lived on spaceship Earth on a crowded planet, all the emphasis on crowding, in a global village. We needed to make this new paradigm shift. We were entering this new era, so on and so forth. And so I carried 2 books with me day and night for 2 weeks, hoping I could find somebody that would pick up on it. And one book was The Aquarian Conspiracy by Marilyn Ferguson, and the other was The Aquarian Gospel of Jesus the Christ. Well, I ran into somebody, pleasant fellow, but he was bordered on the left, and he told me he was thinking of running for city council. I knew every politician in Detroit was knowing on a first-name basis. And I said some pleasant words to him and didn't think anything more about it. And he called me a couple of weeks later and said he definitely was going to run for city council, and he and his wife Marge would be so delighted if I would come to their house and join them for a coming out party the night before. Well, it was Sunday night, and to tell the truth, after I found this material, I was not interested in anybody's political campaign. In fact, I wanted to go to the nearest church and curl up under the nearest altar so I wouldn't get into any more trouble before things came down. And as I thought, if this is going on, things are very close indeed. And so I was on my way to church to curl up under that altar Sunday night, and all at once I thought, maybe you'd better go to that party. Somebody's likely to be there who can tell you more about it. If they're not at that party, it's not big enough to worry about. He was a nice guy, but he tended to attract the eccentrics. So I headed over for the party, and he introduced his campaign manager, and I had had one strange conversation with this woman a year earlier, when Barry was coming out of the hospital after 6 months in the hospital in rehab. And Phyllis Warren, that woman,